Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
And good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I'm your moderator, Ron Bostwick, this morning. And for recording purposes, I will tell you that today is Wednesday, April 10th. It's 10:30 a.m. and this is panel 17973, titled The Incredible Reach of Storytelling. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, and consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure to give you guys a chance to ask questions. And here is how we will handle the Q&A at the conference. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for our questions and answers. We're using a note card system to receive questions from you guys, the audience. At any time during the session today, all you have to do is raise your hand to request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers, who are here on the sides of the room. I ask you to write your question on the card and please write legibly. I have old eyes. If you would, if you're a student, please note this on your card. When you finish, you can raise your hand again to give to the producer who will bring the card up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And if you would please make sure that your cell phones have the ringers turned off. You don't need to kill the cell phones, but just please turn off those ringers. So now I just want to take a moment to briefly introduce all of our panelists at the end. Each of our panelists will take about 3 or 4 minutes to talk about the subject today, about storytelling, and then we'll have a discussion between all of our panelists, and hopefully we'll have some questions by then from the audience. Down at the far end, Danielle SeeWalker is a Coloradan who has been telling the story of her Lakota and Standing Rock Sioux connections in fine art, words, murals, and activism. Former Denver Mayor Michael Hancock appointed her as the city commissioner for the Denver American Indian Commission. She continues to find the true balance of acknowledging the history of Native Americans while making sure that they are accurately represented in contemporary times. In the middle, Mary Reynolds Thompson is a longtime lover of language and the stories that it can tell, going back to her previous life as an advertising copywriter. As the century changed in 2000, so did her heart and soul. Since then, she's been on a journey to connect people to nature, blending poetry and journal therapy through what she calls wild language, and the way that the earth speaks to all of us. I'm sure if you ask her, she will tell you about riding Ramona the pig in Italy. Next to me, 7 years ago, Kika Tuff earned her PhD in ecology from our host, CU Boulder. She's an alum. Just a few weeks later, she founded Impact Media Lab, which helps scientists and science organizations find the compelling stories in their research and develops media campaigns to share those stories with the world. She realized she could do more for science as a communicator, telling those stories, than she could as a practicing researcher. As she says, quote, "Better storytelling is better for science, for a scientist's career, and for our society." And the gentleman on our panel is Matt Williams. He has been a storyteller on screens large and small. He has created, produced, and or written for the TV shows Roseanne, with a Colorado connection, I might add, because Roseanne Barr started her comedy career in Denver, and the television show Home Improvement, another Colorado connection. Tim Allen was born in Denver. And many films are on his resume too. And his storytelling has earned him a Peabody Award for Outstanding Achievement in Television Writing. We are very happy to welcome him and Kika for their very first Conference on World Affairs here in Boulder. So let's just take 3 or 4 minutes for each of our panelists just to talk about storytelling from their perspective. That's why they are here. Why don't we just sort of start on one end and start here with Kika and end with Danielle. Kika?
Sure. So my career in storytelling really started, as a scientist. I was around at the kind of beginning of the climate change conversation when denialism was rising and scientists were rapidly trying to accumulate more data. That's, what we needed. We needed more data. We needed a more widespread consensus, more widespread than 97%, clearly. So, there was this whole race to build information, and then, simultaneously, people were realizing that information isn't what drives behavior or, opinions. It was all about story and cultural connection and trust, and that was something that scientists don't, necessarily do intuitively. So my career pivoted, and I became obsessed with how do we take science and make it feel personal and intimate and very emotionally driven instead of data driven, which is a challenge. So storytelling for me is a path to building a better society and real impact in the world when we know that data isn't enough.
Okay. Mary?
Thank you. When my mother was dying of Alzheimer's, she lost language. She could barely put a word together. But one of my last memories of her is when she recalled her mother, Helen, dancing. And my grandmother loved to dance. She was a mad Irish woman from Brooklyn who had ended up in the north of England. A mop of red hair, legs that went on forever, and she loved to dance. But of course, in the north of England, Bradford, people liked modesty, so she had this pair of dancing knickers. They were silky. And as my mother described it here on really maybe a couple of weeks before she died, she told us this story. She raised her hand up because that's how Grandma was held in the air, and every part of her was alive. She glowed, she was luminous, and her language came back to her in that moment because the story was that powerful and it was hers to tell. So for me, it's not surprising that before we had the word story, we had the word spell, right? And then story came in. But really, stories enchant us, they educate us, they shift our consciousness, they transform. They are very, very powerful. So for me, how I feel about story is this, is we are living in a time when the old stories are dying. We feel it. There's a crumbling away. The myths of progress and perpetual growth and hierarchical systems and colonialism and everything else is crumbling. That's why we're in a mess. So we need new stories. And where do we go for those? So I believe very deeply that we have to go into the depths of our imaginations. This philosopher, French philosopher Henry Corbin, called it the mundus imaginalis. This realm that is as real as the realm of our senses and as real as the rational realm. And we need to resurrect it, because in this realm, we don't just connect to a deeper imagination. We perhaps connect if we go silent enough and we listen deeply enough to the dream of the earth. We listen, and our stories become not just our stories, but in a sense the stories of the animus mundi, the whole of Gaia, a diversity of stories, so that trees tell stories and rivers tell stories. And I'm sure in the science work that you're doing, we learn and we listen to the stories of all beings. I'll just end here, which is, I believe that stories are meant to shift us from the world we're living in now to the world we want to live in. And they have that power. We just have to make sure that they're the right stories.
Well, that is the perfect segue, because what I want to talk about is the power of story. As a species, we need food, water, shelter, and stories to survive. There isn't anything more powerful than telling stories. I'm going to share, I don't usually do this, I'm going to share my personal mission statement because it'll lead into what I want to talk about. As a storyteller, I've told stories on the small screen, the big screen. I'm writing books now. And my personal mission is to make an audience, or cause an audience, to laugh and cry, think and feel, and to awaken their humanity and remind them of their connectedness to their fellow human beings. But in short, the storyteller's primary purpose is to sensitize the tribe. When you're sitting around the campfire telling stories, it's to sensitize the tribe. And what do I mean by sensitize the tribe? That means to make them aware of something. Because what a storyteller does, whether it's in the oral tradition, whether it's on a screen or in front of a live audience, a storyteller takes a spotlight and shines it on a subject or a world or a character and says, this is important, look at this. This is worthy of your attention, pay attention. And by doing that, that is the power to change the world. A friend of mine, Walt Wongren, who was a prize-winning novelist as well as a Lutheran minister, was a founding member of the New Harmony Project, as was I, which is a writer's project in the southern part of Indiana. And what Walt taught me years ago, when we would sit down, he would say, what do you want your story to do? Not what is it about, what do you want your story to do? And is it to shine a light on a cultural heritage? Is it to examine and explore wild women? Is it to make a personal story about cataclysmic climate change? Why are you telling this story? What do you want it to do? And with that comes great responsibility, because the most important question a storyteller must ask his or herself is, what is my intention in telling this story? Am I to uplift and celebrate something, or am I to disparage and condemn? And we all know this. Last night after the opening keynote, I went back, had a meal, and was clicking through the news channels, and I'd go from the liberal to the far extreme conservative, right? And we all know this. But as I was thinking about what do you want your stories to do, and I realized on both extremes, they want the stories to inflame passions, frustrate, and infuriate. They do not want to inform. That's irresponsible storytelling. So I take stories very, very seriously. And you go, well, you're a guy that created sitcoms. I created Roseanne, Home Improvement, worked on The Cosby Show, but I go, there's a strong intent behind those. Like with Home Improvement, we wanted to celebrate an American family. We wanted that to be an aspirational family. And if you, back in the old days, network program, appointment watching television. If you can get 10, 20, 30 million people laughing at the same time, think of the power of that. Yeah. Just the endorphins that are released alone. So I'm thrilled to be on this panel with these people, and storytelling has been my life. It has been since I was a small child. I think, dream, eat, sleep stories. So thank you for having me.
Hihane washte mitaku yapi, Danielle SeeWalker matchapi mahunk papa lakota na uchati shakuini mahata, Denver, Colorado, Awati. Good morning, relatives. My name is Danielle SeeWalker. I come from the Standing Rock Sioux Nation of North Dakota, and I currently reside in Denver. I opened up with a greeting in my language, the Lakota language, which lay dormant for many generations, and I'm humbled to be able to speak it openly without ridicule and without it being illegal, which was the case a generation before me. Our moderator opened up with a land acknowledgement and acknowledged the commitment that CU Boulder has to partnering and elevating and uplifting Native American students and people. And the fact that I'm here sharing with you is a big step up. My dad, for instance, he was born during a time when it wasn't even legal for all Native Americans to vote in this country. And my grandmother wasn't even considered an American citizen at her time of birth. But we belong to this land. We have been here since before colonization. And so it's just incredible that I'm here and I have a commitment and a responsibility to speak up and to storytell. My storytelling started with my existence. My existence is my resistance. And I kind of just sort of had to speak up. My dad once told me, if you don't speak up, nobody's going to do it for you. And so I do that through a multitude of ways. For instance, a lot of people know me as an artist. I'm a visual artist. I do a lot of murals. I have a few murals here on campus. And I'm also a fine artist. I have exhibitions up currently. And but one thing that really sparked me to start storytelling was growing up in North Dakota, where Native American, you were either Native or you were white. There really wasn't a lot of diversity that existed when I was growing up there. And I was always fueled with these stories at home, which were much different than stories being taught or told to me by outsiders looking in at my culture. And I just got to a point where I was really, really tired of the poverty porn and the alcoholism and highlighting all these stories about my people, my family, my culture, which really directly impacts self-identity, how you look at yourself. And as a kid, that impacted me. I was ashamed at one point to be Native American. I remember dyeing my hair blonde, cutting my hair, wanting to change my last name from SeeWalker to Walker. And I got to a point in my 20s where I read an article in the newspaper, and it was about these men at a game throwing beer on Native students at like a high school game and calling them, you're just bound to be an alcoholic. And I just thought, you know what, this is ridiculous. And what about the stories highlighting the positivity in the culture, highlighting the resilience, highlighting our language warriors that are reviving our languages that are going extinct, highlighting our elders who have stories to tell that they weren't able to openly do so for so long. And when they pass, the stories pass with them and they're gone forever. So I started a project called the Red Road Project, and it's all about highlighting the positive, the resilience, the great stories, the rich stories of the cultures of Indian country all over the US. And it's told by Native people the way they want to be heard, not somebody telling and rewriting it and telling it for us. We now have a voice that we can use openly. And so I say all that to say is that I am not a trained writer, I'm not a trained artist. I'm just a community member who has a voice and has a position in the world now to be able to openly tell stories. And so I do that in a lot of multitude of ways. So thank you for having me and listening to us today and sharing space.
So just a reminder that we would love to have your questions, and if you have one, you just raise your hand. Our moderators will come by with cards and pencils for you, and they'll bring them up to me. Before we have our panelists start our discussion, I just want to add in and sort of an overarching point that has been in my mind for 15 years or so, and it was something that has stuck with me ever since. There was a gentleman named Don Hewitt who passed away about 15 years ago. He was the guy that started 60 Minutes on CBS television back in the late 60s. And when he died, I watched a lot of his interviews, and I found that every one of the news stories all had the same clip, which was somebody asking Don Hewitt, to what do you owe the success of 60 Minutes? And he said, it's the 4 words that we said as a child: tell me a story. And storytelling is just inherent in our human nature. And he knew that, and that's what 60 Minutes did. And that's why we are here on this panel, because this panel, I think, deals with everyone on the planet Earth. They don't have to be here at the conference for this panel to be part of them, because storytelling really is a human condition. So I just want to turn to our panelists to just take a moment to say something, if there's something that you left out, or if you want to comment on something that anyone else said, as we get some questions from the audience. Anybody at all? It's a democracy.
I did want to comment on something you had said, Danielle, about being an untrained storyteller, because that resonated with me. I feel like I'm a member of a community. I'm a member of the scientific community. I'm not formally trained in writing or filmmaking either. And I think it's a great time to be a member of a community with stories to tell. And a lot of times, you know, I look back on spending a long time in a career like science and then making a major pivot later on, but that is what it took to find my voice and to find the things I wanted to talk about. And, you know, technology has enabled storytelling in so many ways. You know, you don't need fancy gear, you don't need big budgets, you don't need formal training to just start sharing what you know in a language that people can understand. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a really important time to be anyone who wants to tell a story.
Yeah, I'll respond to that. I think every single one of us are storytellers, and I have to remind myself every day to decolonize my mind. And that really starts with, like, you know, I just caught, you know, you pointed that out. My statement was a very colonized concept. I am not a trained storyteller. But we're all storytellers. My language, the Lakota language, was not a written language up until very recently. And so we were oral storytellers. We passed down our traditions and our way of life in an oral way. And so I come from ancestors that are storytellers by existence. And so thank you for pointing that out, because that's a reminder that I need to reevaluate and decolonize my mind more.
Yeah, I'd like...
Matt?
Yeah, the idea of a storyteller and the oral tradition, because walking over here to this room, Mary said, when did you realize you wanted to be a storyteller? And I said, very young. Mm-hmm. And when I was 4 and 5 years old in the Midwest, what you do when people would drop in is you gather around the kitchen table, put the coffee pot in the middle of the kitchen table, and then everyone start telling family stories. Mm-hmm. And I, as a little child, would crawl under, and I would sit under that table, and I would listen to those stories about how my great-grandfather was killed in the Griffin tornado, and how my grandmother bobbed her hair so she would look older to enter a marathon dance contest with her brother Harold. And the oral tradition and those stories, and that seeped into me. And my father, who was an amateur artist, self-taught, he was a factory line worker. He worked on an assembly line, but he would always create and paint. And when I was very young, we'd walk up to a painting, and he wouldn't say, look at the composition or the texture. Do you notice the contrast? He would, let's say it's a barn, in a snow-covered barn with a light coming out of it. And he would ask me, he says, what do you think's happening inside that barn? And I would stare at the painting. I go, well, there's a horse in there, and she has a baby. And then a whole story would evolve. And I realized it was my father, who had a high school education, that was it. But he was the one who primed that pump and planted that seed of storytelling. And I realized, and the oral tradition I really relate to, because that's what has sustained our family, and those stories will live on with my grandchild. So.
Beautiful. Yeah, I wanted to add that, I work with a lot of people who don't consider themselves to be writers or storytellers and write the most incredibly beautiful things because it comes from a place of authenticity. So authenticity can't be taught. I, as you heard in the introduction, worked as a copywriter, copy editor, promoting everything from cars to cosmetics for a lot of my life. That is taught. That's propaganda. Propaganda kind of needs to be taught because it's a way of really manipulating people. You have to get into their psyches, figure out what they don't really want, but make them really, really want it or really, really believe it. So that's the kind of storytelling that you benefit probably from going to school for. But the storytelling that comes through the families, through the ancestors, through your heart, through your spirit, no, the less education, the better, really, on some level. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a question from the audience that I want to bring up. It's a yes or no question, but I think it brings up the question of being critical in absorbing stories. The question is, do you despair at the inability of so many people who cannot see/hear beyond headlines, or the reduced attention span of so much of society? So while that's a yes or no question, if one of you could expand on that a bit.
I think the way to circumvent that is appeal to the emotion. I want the thought that arises from the emotion, not the emotion that arises from the thought. And if you look at that headline, and we're taught to think in little sound bites now. That's just, oh my God, there's, and we're always, look, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said, 2 emotions drive us, and every decision we make is either love or fear, right? So when I see headlines like that, I ask, what's the intention? What is this story trying to do? Everything is driven by love or fear, and you can't have them at the same time. Perfect love casts out fear. Unfortunately, we are in a fear-driven society now. We sell everything from toothpaste to presidents using fear. When we embrace fear and our storytelling is motivated by that to-do of instilling fear, that then our reptilian brains kick in, our lizard brains, we stop using the frontal lobe and we just react. And that's what's so dangerous about, and the question's a good question because that's what's so dangerous. So look beyond the headlines, look and examine. And that's why I always ask myself, what is this writer, this storyteller, this reporter trying to do?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay. Danielle, I have a question for you that I think is obviously appropriate for you, but I think it also touches on many other parts of our society. The question is it appropriate for non-natives to tell native stories?
I love questions like this, especially in settings where people may not want to openly ask the question for fear of I don't want to be pointed out. But yes, it is. So according to the last census, we make up less than 2% of the entire population in the US, and without allies and people helping to be a voice, to amplify our voices, we may not survive into the long future. So absolutely, I hope that everyone in this room leaves here with a piece of each one of us something, and you then say, oh, I went to this panel today and I heard this really cool story about this, this, and that, and it just trickles on from there. I think we all can use allyship in storytelling, and that's the beauty of stories. They get passed down. So yes, please speak up and be an ally for Native voices. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions that relate to each other, and I think that they can kind of go together. One is, we can all agree that storytelling is wonderful and important, but what are the dangers or watch-outs when it comes to storytelling? The second question is, how would you recommend approaching the work of telling a very difficult, unpleasant, or undesirable story that is taking place in the world? How would I approach telling such a story to the public? I might turn to Mary with that.
Well, thank you.
Well,
I'm glad Mary got that one.
No, but I
I
say that because your storytelling has run the gamut from
Right,
advertising
right,
to being in touch with the earth.
right.
Advertising, as Matt was talking about, fear-based, to being love-based,
Yeah.
love of the earth.
Yeah.
And telling difficult stories doesn't need to be difficult. And because of your breadth of experience, I'd love to hear from you.
Well, in a way, I think we all have to tell difficult stories, right? If there isn't a challenge in a story, if there isn't a big and uncomfortable question in a story, then I think it comes back to what's the point of the story. So I would say that that is embedded in great stories, are these questions of who are we, who do we want to be, what do we want to believe in, what are we willing to sacrifice for? I mean, this is the stuff of heroic tales and epic tales, and it's all about how do we evolve into becoming the kind of humans that we want to be. So I think all stories are difficult. I work in a very different way around ecological devastation. And here it really comes to fear or love. So for me, one of the things that is so important when we talk about climate disruption, when we talk about what we're doing to the environment, is to come from a place of love. If you ask anybody if they want their children to have clean water and clean air, they will nod their heads. This is because we love our children and we want for them the good things in life. If we only tell the story of how despoiled those places are, it brings about a sense of helplessness and grief. So one of the things about, and grief is good, by the way, grief is really good and appropriate, but it can't only be grief. So one of the things I think that we can ask of a story is, does it empower the reader to be a better person, to have more compassion, more empathy, to take action, to do something? Does the story hold images that are so powerful we ingest them and we carry them with us and they work on us so that we can begin to transform those places in us that are resistant to doing what we know in our deepest hearts is the right thing to do? So, yeah.
Kika, this is a question for you. Didn't science used to tell its own story? How does that change your storytelling?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, I think we can always step back in science and see who was telling the stories historically in science. A lot of white men, a lot of rich people. So yes, I think when you look back in history, science used to prioritize story a lot, books and that was sort of part of it. And then we kind of entered a phase where I think in science people have been afraid for a long time that showing any sort of emotion or subjectivity is going to detract from your identity as a scientist, as an objective, data collector. So I don't know how long we've been good at storytelling in science, but I think we've learned over the last, many decades that our stories as scientists are often in direct competition with the marketing and advertising forces at play in the world. And we're starting to realize, that kind of the storytelling we've done in peer-reviewed publications or in NPR interviews, like maybe that is not enough. Maybe we need to be much more proactive than we've been, knowing that, we're up against big oil, we're up against big real estate and land developers, polluters, all these forces with huge marketing budgets. So yes and no. Science, I think has tried for a long time, has succeeded in some ways. But we're in an era where even evolution is under attack. Some of our oldest science. So so anyway, I'll stop there.
I'll open this up to anyone on the panel, and it brings us to today's issues. Discuss using GPT chat, AI, artificial intelligence, in storytelling to help novices become storytellers. Okay, so while you think, let me just put a different angle on this. I see this question as something looking positively at AI, as helping novices become storytellers. If that adds a different angle to the question.
I just spoke, so I'm kind of chomping at the bit. But, I wrote a piece called, F, //, artificial intelligence, let's hear it for ancestral intelligence. I think what we're saying is that we are storytelling beings. The idea that we need artificial intelligence to have us tell stories is so counterintuitive to me. And I really worry about it because, quite honestly, it's effing lazy. It's so effing lazy. The hard part of anything and creating a story is thinking it through, right? Sometimes it drives you mad because you spend ages in chaos trying to find that thread of the story. And through that thread and following it, you end up in all these wildly interesting places that inform you and perhaps evolve your thinking and shift the story. So if we can just, sit on our lounge chairs, sipping our cocktails, having AI do the work for us, I don't like it. Everything in my body says, please don't do that. Not logical, perhaps, but I have a very emotional reaction to it.
And I'll piggyback off that. As a mother of 2 teenage sons in high school and a partner who's a dean in education, I hear stories all the time about Chat GPT, which by the way, I've never used it. I don't even know how to use it. I'm old fashioned. I like paper pencil in my brain. But I worry about, based on the stories I hear from my kiddos and my partner, is that these younger generations just, I got to write a paper about XYZ. Let me just get on Chat GPT and it'll write it for me, and then I'll sort of tweak it a bit. I worry about our future generation, and I feel like their brains are going to melt and just become not really anything but sludge. And so it concerns me from that perspective, is that we're not exercising our brains, our future generation, and that I don't know what that looks like for humanity.
I'll just dovetail very quickly. Jung said that all creativity exists and comes from the realms of the mothers. And I think there's a divine feminine quality to creating, and that's tapping into that ethereal something. Now, you can call it God, goddess, I don't care what label you put on it, but it comes from the realms of the mothers. And that spiritual element, I'm not talking religious dogma, the spiritual element that is poured into a story is what makes it come alive. And if I were to use art, I don't use it either, but I'm not smart enough to. But AI, to edit and tweak, maybe, but to give birth, it's got to come from that divine feminine spot. And a good example is the visual arts. I'm sure Danielle will concur. If you've ever walked up to a Van Gogh painting in the Chicago Institute, and as you approach his self-portrait, I get goosebumps now thinking about it. You feel the artist's energy, the spirit coming out of the pigment. So how can that come off the page or the screen if it's generated by this machine? So if we use it to edit, maybe, but to inspire and give birth to something, I'm totally against it.
I'm a ChatGPT user, so self-proclaimed.
This just turned into an AA meeting.
Exactly. I think everything you're saying up here is true, that, ChatGPT is not for the artists and storytellers with a voice here to make something that will transform you. It's for people trying to get out of writing an essay. It comes through in the work. It's easy to spot. Teachers are getting smarter about spotting it. It's as you mentioned, it's a bit lazy. I do it for newsletters and emails that I don't want to write. And, it's fine for what it is, but it will never replace a story from the heart. Mm-hmm. And I think we've been afraid of technology taking our jobs forever as storytellers, and it hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it ever will, because a real story can't be replaced.
We've been talking about overarching issues and theories. Let's get personal for a moment, and this is for anybody on the panel. Do you have a favorite myth or metaphor that you think can serve us today? In your history, your experiences, even something you've observed? Favorite myth or metaphor that you think can serve us today?
Icarus is the first image that popped into my mind. The hubris of humanity, our anthropocentric impulses are destroying not only the planet, but the universe. We think we are the center of the universe. The universe exists to serve not only us, but me. And we have become so anthropocentric in our desires and our drives, and that is pure hubris. And that at some point, our wings are going to melt, and we're going to come crashing down. And this goes across the board for everyone, from respecting cultural heritage, to saving the planet, to celebrating diversity and inclusion. All of that goes back to our own hubris, and you see it. It's easy to pick on politicians, but you also see it corporate greed. You see it in CEOs. You see it in Hollywood. So Icarus is the first image that pops into my mind.
Anyone else? Danielle?
I would say, there's a multitude of stories that have impacted me, but I would say just overarching, Indigenous knowledge can really address a lot of things that we're facing today in terms of the environment, water, our winged relatives, our water relatives, food sovereignty. We look at what's in the grocery store, everything's in a package these days, but that's not Indigenous for any of us. So I just want to comment on, Indigenous knowledge, I think is really important in many aspects of all of our livelihoods.
And I'd say yes to Icarus and yes to Indigenous knowledge. I recently taught a course on fairy tales, and one of them that really struck me was The Emperor and the Nightingale. I don't know if you know that one, but it really comes down actually to kind of chat GPT thingamajiggy, because the emperor wants to tame the nightingale to sing absolutely when he wants it to sing perfectly over and over and over again. The nightingale can't do it, goes back to the forest to be wild, and he's left gifted this mechanical nightingale, right? And it's beautiful, and it's gold, and it's encrusted with jewels. And then it breaks down. And the poor emperor gets so sick because he doesn't have his nightingale singing to him. And finally, somebody's sent into the forest to bring back what is real, what is wild, what can't be tamed, what is beautiful. And out of the generosity of the spirit of the wild, the nightingale sings to the emperor, and he gets well. And he realizes that he has to allow that nightingale to be free, that nightingale has its own reason for being there. He's humbled. He's humbled. So that's one that really speaks to me for today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel like I want Mary to be like the narrator for all audiobooks. I mean,
I agree to that.
I'm like, oh.
Very good.
I'll stay in the personal realm with this question, and again, for anybody. Can you talk about the cathartic effect of personal storytelling?
I'll say that for me, it's medicine. The way I storytell a lot is through my art, visual arts. Sometimes I don't have words for how I'm feeling or how I want to convey something that's going on in my brain or a lived experience. And I sort of look back and think about maybe that's in my DNA, because I mentioned earlier my language we didn't have a written language. The way we documented and told our stories was either orally or through visuals, ledger arts drawn on animal hides, and that told the story. And so I'm almost thinking it's innate for me to be a visual artist and tell stories that way. And so for me, when I'm feeling a certain way, or I'm experiencing something, or I'm feeling a certain, thing about Gaza, for instance, is on my mind a lot. I don't know how to express myself other than painting or drawing or sketching. And so for me, it's cathartic in the way that it's my medicine. It's without that release, I can't cope.
Are you talking personal catharsis or for the reader or the viewer? I mean, because every story you write or every painting you make or every discovery you make in science, it is cathartic. And all storytelling is transformative. Where you are as a reader or a viewer at the beginning of the story and where you are at the end of the story, you should be a different person, even ever so slightly, because all art is transformative. But if you're talking about a personal catharsis, I can tell you, and I'm not plugging my book, but when writing it, I discovered things I didn't know I had hidden in my deep unconscious. And some of it very dark and fearful, and some of it so ineffably joyful that the whole writing process was cathartic for me. And I hope if I have that experience, then maybe it will translate to an audience and they will have that experience, have that same emotional catharsis.
I would just add one thing. I've been sober for 40 years now. And if any of you are in 12-step, then the core of 12-step is sharing your story. There is nothing more healing than being witnessed, held, and loved through the process of telling your story. So deeply cathartic.
Yeah, and in my work, I don't tell my story very often, but I work with scientists a lot to talk about their story, and we always start with the question of why. Why do you do this work? Why do you study an obscure beetle in this remote part of the world? And, you're sort of living this life and career that a lot of people don't even understand why you do what you do. And I've been surprised how rarely we ask ourselves really fundamental questions. Why are you doing this, day in and day out? Why is this meaningful for you? Why is this meaningful for others? And, as a storyteller, you're trying to tap into this universal quality that this person has that we could all connect to, which is passion and adversity and commitment and all these things. But I have watched people be so transformed in answering really basic questions about themselves. And, to know yourself is this ultimate power where you go forth in a more confident, fashion. And when you know your story and you own your story, you walk through the world very differently. And so even as filmmakers or as storytellers, I think what we do can be a gift to the people that we work with, because you get so caught in the weeds sometimes of your life. It helps to have someone step you back into kind of your own purpose.
Kind of related to personal storytelling, this person says, is there a responsibility of the writer to anonymize, make anonymous, negative details of characters in a memoir? Is it just better to go the route of, quote, auto-fiction? And they signed it confused. Like we're Ask Amy. To anonymize negative details of characters in a memoir, which is a little outside of the experience of people here when we're talking about memoirs, but your opinions?
I think it goes back to intention. Are you revealing these negative aspects about a character that you lived with or grew up with or dated or married or whatever, to condemn them or to cast yourself as the victim of a bad relationship? Are you doing it to highlight the complexity of that individual's complete character? Because look, all four of us sitting here are presenting you right now our persona. This is who we want all of you to think this is who we are. And we've got dark thoughts and rage and passion and volcanoes living inside all four of us right now that you're not seeing. So, and little snippets of that will come out in a mural or a book or in a report or scientific. So, yes, you can reveal that, but is the intention to demean that person or to, again, where's that light that we're shining on that person to show the complexity of that human being? Because we all have a shadow side. We all do. And we like to keep it hidden. And good writing does expose it.
Yeah. I also love what Emily Dickinson says, tell the truth, but tell it slant. You know? So, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Yeah, thank you.
And to sort of take another angle on that question, again, it's a yes or no question, but I think it brings up a possibility of just going deeper into it. Is storytelling a double-edged sword? A tool to tell the truth, the whole truth, and a weapon to spread lies?
Yes, absolutely.
So again, it's a yes or no question, but let's go a little deeper. Don't answer it yes or no. Answer it yes or no with your answer.
Anybody?
I just heard that lies are more easily believed than the truth. They've been doing this study of how things get percolated throughout the social media, and essentially lies seem to be more convincing, which I find quite frightening. But yeah, they're stories. It's all magic has a shadow. All magic
and I
has a
believe,
shadow.
to dovetail with Mary, lies are simple. Truth is complicated.
Yes, yes,
And that's the big difference, and that's why it's so easily to
yes,
accepting lies.
absolutely.
And I'll share a really common story I think that most of us in this room have learned, and it's the story of 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. And we all bought into that. Well, I didn't, but that was a story. But the truth is much more complicated. And how many of you know the truth? I challenge you to maybe dig into that a little bit.
Matt, this question is for you. It says, Matt, you mentioned, quote, you mentioned thinking through, quote, what you want your story to do. Can you speak more to thinking through that process of connecting story to purpose?
Yes, it's what do you want your story to do? I'll draw on a personal example, and I'm not plugging the book, but with the book, I wanted to open hearts. I wanted to consciously engender compassion and celebrate kindness. And sometimes as writers, sometimes you have to have, every good story is simple. It has a simple premise, a simple theme, a simple, clean idea. And the students I teach, they want to say everything they have ever thought in that story. I go, no, break it down to one thing. So when I go, I ask myself, if an individual in the audience right now is reading this story, how do I imagine them reacting to it? How do I imagine, when you say we carry them, and we do carry our stories, everything you read and see is somewhere filed away in your unconscious mind. What kind of impact is that going to have on a viewer or a reader? And so that's a conscious thought of what you want it to do. Now, once you've defined that, then you start scraping away story elements that don't do that. I'll give you an example. My brother said, "Boy, you sugar-coated some of this stuff." And I go, "That's because I wasn't shining a light on these people's flaws. I was celebrating what made them flawed individuals who were wonderful human beings." So I don't know if that answered the question, but it is part of the same process. And what Mary talks about is those hours of thinking and thinking and thinking. It takes very, very, very major effort to get simple. And the simpler you become, the more powerful the story, the art, whatever.
Can I follow up with that?
Sure.
Because I would say in my work, we take that question and almost break it into two. The first question being, what do you want an audience to feel? Do you want them to feel intelligent or inspired or mad or sad or what? And then we sort of reverse engineer stories that make audiences feel what we want them to feel. And then the second thing that we do is, how do you want them to act after they've seen the story? This is kind of this growing space of impact production. In films, we've been making environmental documentary films for a long time, and you put them in a festival and people watch it and they get sad or happy or glad or inspired, and then they walk away and maybe do nothing. And so, we're kind of at a place too where we're often designing media with an action built in. So at the end of a film, it says, if you care about this, support this organization, or call your senator and voice your support of this thing or that thing. So we're even kind of getting into some spaces where we design stories to lead to change, and change is sort of built in from the beginning.
Danielle, this question is directed to you, but I feel like Mary and Kika can also chime in afterwards. It says, science, the earliest stories are from the earth. From your perspective, how does the earth speak the original stories of science?
It speaks it to me every day, all day. Where I come, we're star knowledge people. My ancestors looked to the stars for our knowledge. We believe we come from the stars, and then we come to this earth for a human journey, and then we go back to the stars where our ancestors live. And what's really interesting is where I grew up along the Missouri River that goes into the Mississippi River. When you look up into the sky, you see the Milky Way galaxy right above it, and it's a reflection, a mirror image. We call it a Kapemni, as above is below. And so the knowledge of the stars are very much at the center of a lot of it, but we also listen to our Unchimaka, our grandmother Earth. She provides everything we ever could need, and everything works in a circle, and it's very beautiful. We happen to be intelligent creatures that can speak, and so we have an obligation to speak up for the water, for the earth, for our winged relatives and our animal relatives. And so it's all a circle in a very decolonized scientific way.
Beautiful.
Mary, Kika, do either of you want to add into that?
Well, that was very, very beautiful and very true. I think one of the real issues we have with story now is that it's disconnected from the earth, and we're telling it as though we're not part of nature and the earth. So it's this very sort of hierarchical, hubristic mentality, and that's why so many of the stories are destructive and toxic. So I feel this, in our sort of modern human way, that it's really important for us to do that listening and to begin to tell the stories. And I think more and more people are. I think of writers like Terry Tempest Williams, if you know her, David Abrams, many extraordinary writers who are beginning to find a voice for the earth, to really begin to generate the kind of stories that can set us back into intimate relationship with nature. So I think that's a huge shift that we are making, and we need more and more and more of us to focus on.
And I did a mural recently in the engineering building on campus, specifically for our Native students that are studying the sciences, but want to keep and hold on to that indigenous knowledge. And the mural is called Star Knowledge. And so if you go over there, it's a very different type of mural than what I typically do, because I've integrated sort of this scientific aesthetic into it, but you'll look at it and you'll see a lot of symbolism and a lot of deep meanings that translate back to the original ancient scientific knowledge of the earth.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to see that science has always been a quest to understand what the world is trying to teach us. You know, it is us trying to understand those lessons using a method our human brains can, sort of wrap our minds around. I'll just put in a plug. You've probably read it, but if you haven't, Braiding Sweetgrass is, just sort of story after story of the lessons that nature has revealed about ourselves. And
yeah, amazing book.
So good.
It's amazing.
Matt, I want to ask the question I think everybody in the room wants to ask you. Is your book available in the lobby?
I think it's in the bookstore. I've not seen it.
Good.
There's rumors, and I think other people on here have some books down there. So,
I just wanted to make sure that you got that plug in.
Okay.
For you. Because we're on a college campus, I'll admit that I'm learning something new with this question. I'll ask the question, and then I'll give it some background. The question is, do you think that Grisham's law applies to human versus AI storytelling? And for those of us that did not know Grisham's law, I had to look it up. In economics, Grisham's law is a monetary principle stating that, quote, bad money drives out good.
Bad money.
Bad money drives out good. So back to the question, do you think that Grisham's law applies to human versus AI storytelling?
Kika?
I'm new to Grisham's law to sort of, if we think about all right, if AI is combing the internet for stories are often fueled by money, probably it sort of tracks. But the stories that last are the good ones.
Authentic,
so,
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, that may bring me to the next question, which is specifically directed to you. Do you have any suggestions for translating data/information to story in giving talks and writing scientific pieces?
Do I? Well, actually, I was hoping to talk to Matt about DNA of storytelling, but when I work with scientists, we talk a lot about how to take information and just try and tap into something universal, which I mentioned before. The thing I love about science is it's just story after story after story. It's a person driven by a quest to understand some phenomenon in the universe. It is the hero story we are all so pre-programmed to understand and connect with. We really should, it should be so easy as scientists to be good storytellers, but trying to shed the nuances. That's the challenge of this work. And for my work in science communication is trying to figure out how much of the analysis has to be included in the story. You want to help people build trust in your data, and also you don't want to go too deep in the weeds of your model or your tests to validate data. So it's a constant challenge, but I think the easiest thing you can do as a scientist is ask yourself the question of why, and always start with that. Open every talk with why this work was meaningful for you. How does it change science? How does it change the world? If you can roll in your backstory of how you stumbled into this question, this gap in knowledge, those are things that people can really connect with, and then save all the stats to the end that way as they start to peter out, and then come back to your origin story at the end.
This next one really relates to everyone in the room because we're all human beings. It reminds me of a quote that I recently read that said, any human being who lives to be 8 years old has more than enough material to write about. So the question is, How do you help people get their story out of them, even if they feel that they don't have a story?
Be a good listener. Because we don't listen to understand. We listen to form our opinion. As we're listening, we're already getting our response to deep listening. And you can sit down with any child and say, tell me what happened today on the way home. And if you honestly listen to them, they will just keep talking and the story will keep evolving. And I think because of the chat, social media world we live in, we don't deep listen. And I think truly to respect and love someone, the best gift you can give them is your full, undivided attention, and listen not only to the words, but what's happening inside them as they're telling you the story. And it's pretty, in your tradition, it was an oral tradition in my family, you have to fight to get a word in around our kitchen table because everyone's talking at once. And my wife calls it William's exaggeration. Everyone's, oh God, he lost his leg. No, he stubbed his toe. But everyone's fighting to tell the story. So I think it's just being a good listener and encouraging that. But it takes a pause, a time out, some still time for that to happen, rather than, And I see these parents pushing their stroller and they're doing this, and I'm going, put the damn phone away, pay attention to your child. And that sounds so simple, but it's true. And it begins with something that simple.
As somebody that interviews people a lot to get stories out, to document these stories, I find that a lot of times that's what it's really just in a quiet place, undistracted, and you ask questions. Get it to tell me about this or tell me about a time, and make it more than a yes or no. Everyone, I find a lot of people at first don't want to open up, but once they do, it flows. And everybody, I think, loves talking about themselves. I think naturally. So
it's also withholding judgment.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if as the other person's talking, you're going, well, they're going to read that body language, even a child, and they're going to start shutting down. If you truly give them your full attention. But
yeah. And even sometimes I know there's an awkward silence. And as much as you, as the interviewer, or somebody wanting to extract the story, you want to jump in and make it not awkward for the other person, you got to have that awkward silence, because then they will eventually start speaking up.
I think there's one thing I would add, because I totally agree with everything that's been said, is you can also mirror, because sometimes it's very hard for people to hear themselves. So, and it doesn't matter if in mirroring you get it wrong. That's not the point. You could say something like, that sounds like a very tender memory, something simple. Now they may say to you, no, it wasn't tender at all, it's fine. Doesn't matter. The point is that you're helping them to hear themselves. And what we're really trying to do, I think, in storytelling, to take the complex and make it simple, is help people find that thread, right? Mm-hmm. And so sometimes just a few verbal cues, a few kind of very simple mirroring techniques can help people go, yes, and it was tender, and that's not the only place I'm feeling tender. And then suddenly we're beginning to string something together.
I'm gonna test your storytelling abilities when I tell you that we only have a few minutes for this last question for anybody, but I want to save this for the last because it looks forward, and I'm guessing that it came from a writer or an author. The question is, how do you get your intended audience to find your stories? In just a couple of minutes, anyone?
Do you mean the stories we've written or tell?
Yeah. How do you get your intended audience? You have written, so you have a story. How do you get your audience to find your stories? It's a very amorphous question for you to answer in any way you want.
I can give a pretty straightforward answer, because I remember going through the process of making our first film and thinking, great, we made a film, we're going to put it out there on the internet, and everyone's going to discover it, and it's going to be viral overnight. Perhaps you've had this experience where turning your art loose on the internet doesn't often go anywhere. Mm-hmm. Turning your film loose on YouTube doesn't, people don't just find stuff. It's crowded out there. So, this is why marketing and advertising and all of those campaigns exist. From the beginning of the design of your story, you have to be thinking about output and how will anyone find it in a busy world. And sometimes that can, at least in my world, it changes the way we tell stories a lot. If we think, this would be a really good outlet for PBS, that's a different tone than Nat Geo, which is a different tone than a YouTuber who we really connect with and think they could amplify. And so the design of how your audience is going to find your story becomes part of it from the very beginning, and thinking about social campaigns and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
I'm very strategic sometimes. If I have something I want to convey, sometimes you can find me marching into the Capitol building, like getting in front of senators and being like, I have something to say. Or if I'm doing a mural and it's very strategic, for instance, the mural I did here, I wanted it to be for Indigenous students studying sciences, so I did it there. Or, as much as I hate doing interviews or things like that, a lot of times with media, because I find they can misconstrue it. I can't tell you how many 3 people walked, as I was walking to this room today, 3 people said, I heard you on NPR. So I know and I'm tapping into places strategically that I know there's an audience that needs to hear what I'm saying. And so, that's a lot of what I do. Murals, I'll put a mural somewhere where I know it's in an area that a lot of maybe non-native people pass by every day, that I need them to look at this mural to maybe see something. So that's kind of how I put myself out there.
And before we wrap up, I just want to remind you that there is another panel in here at noon in 20 minutes. So if you have any discussions, if you would take them out into the lobby, please, and help me to say thank you to our panelists for being here today, especially our 2 rookies.